What was your holy crap? I'm witnessing history moment. The 2011 tsunami in Japan. At some point, they were just running live video with no commentary. It was horrifying. Watching people scramble for their lives. Everything just washing away in a slow, grey, unstoppable wall of water. Dude, that was jaw-dropping. Water just kept rising. I was touring the CNN building in Atlanta when Nelson Mandela died. Literally right when the story broke. The creepy part was that they already had a ton of pre-recorded stuff ready to go. They had pre-made scripts for the anchors. It wasn't chaos. It was like they had a pre-made list of stuff to say and do. That's someone's job. Speculating who will die next and creating pre-death obituaries. Maybe these already exist for all the most famous people and it's someone's job to keep them updated. When a news story can go global in a matter of hours, you can't afford to wait for things to happen before you cover them. Someone else will have better, juicier information than you and they'll get all that sweet ad revenue unless you beat them to the punch. You just know that some people are pee about writing and rewriting tributes for Elizabeth II for decades. The Frontier Middle School shooting on the 2nd of February, 1996. It happened in my hometown. It was the first mass media coverage of a school shooting at the time. Watching the TV, that night every news channel was reporting it. Local, regional, and national news. About 6:30 p.m. I learned my best friend had died from being shot while watching the 6 o'clock news. The 1st of May, 2011, EST. Hearing the news, followed by the mob starting to form and celebrate the news that Bin Laden was taken out, was a surreal experience. I was at Penn State studying for finals when I hear a cowbell outside of your dorm. I look outside and see someone dressed as Captain America banging on a cowbell and a group of people chasing him carrying an oversized American flag. Within 10 minutes a massive crowd developed and ran all the way down, over a mile, to the main road. The OJ chase. He was such a beloved figure, always smiling, down-to-earth sports commentator, movie star. Next thing you know, he's fleeing down the highway in his white SUV with police in pursuit. So surreal. When he was found not guilty, I was a freshman in college. I remember looking out my window, seeing a naked man running through campus screaming the juice is loose. I remember also recognizing that the world is a much stranger place than I had originally thought. When Princess Diana died, I was 8 years old. My parents and I were finishing up visiting their friends when my mom turned on the radio and she started to cry, realizing some Diana girl got in a car accident. A week later I was peeved because I couldn't watch my Saturday morning cartoon because my mom was watching the funeral procession. I realized later how much of an impact Princess Diana's death had on everyone. My brother tricked me into watching a jump scare video on the 10th of September. The next morning he woke me up to tell me that two 747s had been flown into the World Trade Center. I didn't believe him and went back to bed. It was similar for me, without the lead in. I was asleep and a friend called to tell me that terrorists were crashing airliners into the WTC and Pentagon and crap. I told him to stop joking and let me get back to sleep. The 9th of August, 1995. That date probably doesn't mean much to most people, but it should. That's the unofficial Big Bang of the internet. The birth date of the viable, commercial medium we know today. On that day, 22 years ago, Netscape had their IPO. Before that moment, the world at large didn't view the internet as a world-changing medium. It was considered a novelty by most. Pre-1995, the internet was largely non-profit in the realm of academics and early enthusiasts. Commercial applications, in particular e-commerce, were still the stuff of dreams and discussed with a healthy dose of skepticism. Then Netscape IPO'd and shattered Wall Street expectations, setting the stage for dozens of high-flying tech IPOs throughout the late 90s. In August of 1995, there were only around 12 million internet users. In comparison, there are 15 million users subbed to our AskReddit. Today, there are 3.6 billion. Even now, when you look up internet statistics, so many of them begin at the summer of 1995. That was when the world at large took notice. Recall that Netscape's direct competitor, Spyglass, had just IPO'd 6 weeks prior. They issued 2 million shares at $17 apiece. closing at $27.12, and this was considered an incredibly successful tech IPO at the time. Netscape shattered those numbers, issuing 5.75 million shares, opening at $28 and closing at $58.25 with an intraday high of $74.75. It was bananas. Netscape's IPO was the best opening day for a stock in history for an issue of its size. For those of us who had grown up with the early internet and were in the industry, that IPO was as profound as Apple computers in 1980. Many of us immediately understood that we were witnessing a historical moment. Going to lunch in high school, looking up, and seeing the solid rocket boosters from the Challengers spiraling down out of an atypical cloud puff in the smoke trail from launch. I thought, that doesn't look right. Then 9/11. But that's been said. Wait, a solid rocket booster from the Challenger crashed into your school. Anti-Ceausescu protesters on TV holding up the flag with a hole that led to the Romanian Revolution of 1989, the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, ending the Cold War. Kesan. Back in 1967 to 1968, the 3rd Marine Division had a phi base on the extreme west end of the Dimarca bases just south of the DMZ. The base was in the angle between the Vietnamese DMZ and the Laotian border. Kesan had been under siege for like 8 months before I got out there. It was a huge deal. The North Vietnamese had committed a sizable part of their army to taking the base. Giap wanted to repeat his success at Dien Bien Ph, where he took a similarly isolated French base and ended the French occupation of North Vietnam. Press speculation and the US entered a fever pitch after the Tet Offensive in late January 1968. Dien Bien Ph was on every newspaper columnist's list of scary things. I had been reading about it all stateside. Seemed pretty desperate for the US. I arrived in country in February 1968, and I was employed as an artillery air observer by Divati of the 1st Cavalry Division. We were flying missions over the west end of the DMZ in preparation for Operation Pegasus, where the Cav was going to relieve the siege of Kesan. So I saw the base from the air. I saw the North Vietnamese trenches zigzagging toward the perimeter of Kesan across a moonscape of bomb craters. And I saw personally just how fricked up the American press can get a story. There was no way the NVA was gonna take Kesan. The base was enormous, well dug, well supplied and loaded with Marines. The Air Force had turned the surrounding jungles into a charnel house. The B-52 arc light boxes were taking out whole regiments of NVA at a time. All the zigzag trenches ended well before the Kesan wire in a maze of overlapping bomb craters. Honestly, we couldn't have taken Kesan unless the Marines let us in, which they did. Another story. So, OP, is it fair to say I witnessed history that never happened? The fall of Kesan and the end of the American military adventure in Vietnam? The press were so sure that was gonna happen. What happened was historical bores. When the base didn't fall, there were no celebrations. The press just moved on to the next hyperbolic story. They didn't seem to learn anything from the failure of their confident, historically inevitable predictions. But I did. Tiananmen Square. I was in college and had to find summer rooming. There was a room in the grad student's apartment available, and I found myself living with 5 Chinese grad students. We kept fairly friendly, but their English was fair, and my Mandarin is non-existent. As events unfolded in Beijing, no attention was spent on studying. 4 televisions were on constantly with the various networks, and anticipation was growing that the student protests in Beijing could be successful. If the Berlin Wall could fall, and Ceausescu could be overthrown, then the same could happen in China. There were rumors of divisions among various governors generals in China, and that some wouldn't follow the orders of the government. How could the army attack peaceful protesters? Then the People's Liberation struck back. It was disheartening to see the dismay in the eyes of these roommates of mine, and within a few days they stopped talking about it, perhaps not knowing if one of their fellow roommates was working as an informant. 35W bridge collapse in MN. I was out in public when it happened, and remember seeing the news all of a sudden cut to the story, then seeing more and more people around me turn and watch the news. It was that moment when you knew who had family members making their commute home on 35W, and especially the family who didn't pick up their phones. I'll never forget seeing how quickly people went from their normal just another day attitudes to sadness and fear. That was such a crazy day. I can't believe it has been almost 10 years. The tsunami in Sendai, Japan. I remember a classmate had just done his presentation about Viking mythology and we started watching this boring educational news program. Normally it would be just a recap of the week and some cringe-worthy cool guy giving advice. This time, however, the presenter was quite shocked and confused and we saw the same footage over and over again. It was my first experience with breaking news. Well, I was a sophomore in HS and in art class. I had my laptop out and went to Yahoo and saw there was a shooting at an elementary school. That whole day I was refreshing Yahoo to see more. There was one suspect, now two, now back to one suspect. Gunman is dead. 20-something children are dead. By the time I got to my last period class, my teacher had the TV on and watching the news. It was scary. For some reason they almost always report that there are 2-3 gunmen even though it's almost always one. I guess the information overload just leads to a lot of conflicting content. My mom pointed out Senator Larry Craig to me in an airport once while in Minnesota. Didn't realize until many years later that I witnessed history. I'm from Idaho, so it's history on some level, I guess. Can you elaborate? Covering 9/11 as a reporter, there was a moment that morning when Giuliani was nowhere to be found and a bunch of reporters were gathered around a fireman at Ground Zero. He couldn't tell us much, so at some point someone asked him who was in charge. "No one's in charge," he said. "They're all dead." The November 2015 Paris attacks, I guess. My roommate was in a cafe right next to the one they attacked. I took a Uber when he called me and went to pick him up. Cops were everywhere. Chaos and panic in the streets. Luckily we acted quick enough. They locked the area just when we found him. His parents were furious, since we couldn't know if the attacks had stopped. Then we turned on the TV and we realized what was happening. The 15th of June, 2011. The day that I watched the Vancouver Canucks get so close to the Stanley Cup win, only to watch them lose and our city burn. To be fair, they were gonna burn the city down if they won too. You knew a riot was gonna happen. Just for what reason? Election night. Hearing TV stations say that Clinton no longer had a path to victory immediately felt surreal to me. Regardless of the politics, it marked a major establishment candidate being defeated by someone who had previously never held a public office. The coup attempt in Turkey last year, following live on YouTube, Reddit and then the other media outlets. And before anyone asks, yes, I believe it was an inside job. I was going to say this too. My co-worker somehow caught it within 45 minutes of the first shots. It was wild to see it literally starting, get into full swing, and then slowly get shut down. I thought it was legit, but looking back soon after, it was definitely a ruse to gain more power. The 17th of January, 1991, watching aircraft launch from the deck of the USS Saratoga with full bomb racks, then seeing them land a couple hours later with empty bomb racks. But not all of them came back. A few days later, a cruiser was steaming off our port side. We all went up to the flight deck and watched them launch one Tomahawk missile after another. When the first one launched, our skipper got on the 5MC and said, "That one is headed for downtown Baghdad." Don't know if this counts, but I have tickets to see the Ringling Brothers in March. It's their final show after over 100 years. The Utah shooting, Oslo bombing in Norway in 2011. I was packing for a camp when I checked Facebook and my dad posted that there was some kind of explosion in Oslo. I was stuck to the TV the rest of the day. I didn't know anyone on the island at that time, but I've met a few after, and the heck they went through is something a kid never should go through. Also in 2011 my history teacher made a comment about the Arab Spring and that what we were seeing in Egypt and Syria was history in the making. The night they caught the Boston bomber, we were near a bunch of hospitals where a blockade had been stationed during the city-wide lockdown. As it broke up, we flooded the sidewalks, shook the hands of the emergency responders. I saw the first tower engulfed in black smoke with my own eyes from my school window. I remember other teachers coming into our room because only that room had the view of the city. It was 3rd grade. Probably only the teachers knew it was a historical moment. 1. Man's first step on the moon. 2. Nixon resigning. 3. Iranian hostages being taken. 4. John Lennon being shot, the aftermath. 5. Reagan being shot. 6. The whole Tiananmen Square events in 1989 and OMG the bravest man on earth staring down those tanks. 7. Watching 1989 San Francisco earthquake live on the World Series broadcast. 8. Both Gulf Wars starting. 9. Lots of live SNL moments. Classic Belushi and Chris Farley moments. Sinead O'Connor tearing the Pope's picture up. Big WTF moment. Nirvana's first appearance, etc. In 2001 I was going to Rutgers Newark and NJ. I was running late for my 8 AM class. I was on Route 1 heading toward Route 21 when the first plane hit. I saw an explosion. I had Howard Stern on and they started talking about it. Traffic stopped dead in its tracks. We couldn't do anything for hours except stand on the roof of our cars and watch. I was on the highest point on a bridge in the northbound lane. Perfect view of the city. I never realized that on Monday it was the last time that skyline would look like that. I swore I could hear the plane's turbines roar as the second plane hit, but it was all a few seconds behind. Saw the plane moving strange, roar a second later, fireball. Then we waited for it, the bang. The whole time in the background Howard Stern was saying it was an attack already. He didn't frick around. We all looked at each other, complete strangers. Mercedes, Jeeps, Clunkers, Jaguars, and Tauruses. We didn't know each other's names, but we all knew we were watching something happen. I'll never see those people again. I was 21, immature, but at that moment when we looked into each other's eyes, there was no race, there was no religion, no Democrats or Republicans bickering about stupid crap. We were Americans, we were scared, we were helpless, and we were mad. We witnessed 2 historic events that day. The first was obvious, the second was that it was last time I can remember everyone banding together as a country, putting every single difference aside, and just hoping that everyone else was okay. Saw a guy drive straight from a turning only lane and promptly caused a 4-car pileup. That was some expert level dumbassery. 9/11, 2004 Asian tsunami, Hurricane Katrina, Obama's victory in 2008, financial crisis of 2008, death of Osama bin Laden, Brexit, Trump's victory in 2016. Gestures broadly at EC. Honestly though, I feel like America is on the precipice of something critical, either from the government or as a reaction from our wildly unhappy populace. Something is going to give. I live with my parents. I'm 18 and in college, and recently we all sat down and discussed what we do if all heck broke loose in society and something big happened, since we live in a small redneck town full of gun owners. To quote Craig Ferguson, I know, it's not going to happen, but it might happen, and I feel better having simply talked it through. Time for something a bit more lighthearted. Seeing Star Wars Episode 3 in theaters. That was, at the time, the official ending of one of the most successful and well-known movie franchises of all time. That one's totally getting buried under the mass, but I was in Hong Kong during the umbrella movement. Casually went working my shift at a bar somewhere in Soho. When I went out of there after a few hours, a shitton of cops in riot gear everywhere. Roadblocks on Queens Road. Imagine the 5th Avenue in NYC completely blocked. People sitting on the ground, and other main streets. People marching and signing all together. God, that was intense. And most impressive of all, despite all the people on both sides, police and demonstrators, not a single window, car, shop or public installation was damaged. After each sitting session, some of the protesters would stay and clean after people. Cleanest, most responsible demonstration I've ever seen. Obama becoming president. 9/11. Very faint memory though. The successful SpaceX landing. Trump becoming president. David Bowie dropping an album predicting his own death right before dying. The crap ISIS is doing and the economic crisis of 2008. At 16, I have only recently started caring about the outside world. So for me, it was Trump's win. The US was complete apeshit for a good while after. Seeing Spaceship One reach orbit for the first time. It was the first private, non-government, program to achieve space travel. It opened the door to Virgin building the first public spaceport. It allowed privatization of space exploration, which created immense possibilities for innovation that had been stalled by government intervention for decades. We are still in the infancy of it, but the progress made in the past 15 years is already substantially greater than what was done in the 45 years prior since humans landed on the moon. For clarity, the space shuttle used by NASA, up until it was retired a few years ago, was still relying on instruments built prior to Windows or Apple computers being invented. Spaceship One never went into orbit. It was a suborbital hop that just passed the Kármán line. Last night's Super Bowl for sure, but also I watched Paul Pierce's three-pointer earlier in the day as a Clipper in Boston. Entered with 12 seconds left, got to pull up for a long three and drained it. Childhood favorite player. Watching LeBron go off in Game 6 against the Celtics was just amazing to watch. You knew he wanted that ring badly. Nixon resigning. I was a kid when it happened. I remember being very confused because I didn't think a president was allowed to quit. Also the Challenger explosion, the Berlin Wall coming down, and of course 9/11. Watching Jack Ruby shoot Lee Harvey Oswald on Live TV with my dad. We saw it and both jumped to our feet saying, "Did you see that?" This week, I live in Romania and there are tens or hundreds of thousands of people protesting every day and night across the country against corruption. I am so proud of all the men, women and children who spend their days in front of the government's office in Bucharest or anywhere in Romania. On Sunday, Romanian people living in over 200 cities across the globe, Antarctica included, spent their evening supporting the protests. In person, probably the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. On TV, watching the Second World Trade Center tower get hit by plane 2. I was born the week after Lady Di died, and I remember 9/11, but people already mentioned that. I honestly think the most recent Pope stepping down and offering the position to now, Pope Francis, was incredibly historical. It's the first time in history we've had a living person who was the Pope. I was on a school trip to DC while the gay marriage decision was going through the Supreme Court. We wandered through the crowd of LGBT and anti-LGBT outside the courthouse. The decision wouldn't be announced for weeks, as it federally isn't for things like that, but it was amazing knowing I was present at such a historic moment for America and that movement. This isn't like world history or anything, but it's really big for my school. The first big event I worked in my social media job was the groundbreaking ceremony for the Merced 2020 project in October. It's the first project of its kind, a contract between the school, which is public, and private construction companies, and it's happening at the youngest and smallest UC campus. The project is aiming to get I think like 13 buildings up and running by 2020, enough space to support 10,000 students. We have around 7,000 right now, and it's incredibly cramped. UCM is only 11 years old, but it's still the biggest thing to happen here. It's really exciting to be able to watch it grow over the next few years while I'm here. On the 12th of December, 2003, I was induced for preeclampsia at 39 weeks. He was born early on the 12th of December. I hemorrhaged during the day and almost died, receiving a blood transfusion that night. I woke up the next morning finally able to hold my son, and as I was nursing him the first time, flipped on the TV to CNN to see if anything interesting had happened the day he was born. The only thing they were talking about was how Saddam had been captured the day before. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.